Please consider becoming a patron of MythVision Podcast. You'll get early access to every video, including this amazing one, and you can ask me personal questions, private message me, anything you'd like. Professor Elaine Pagels, welcome to MythVision Podcast. I have been a huge fan of yours since, I'd say, 6-7 years ago. But before that, this is our introductory show. This is the first one. I actually avoided you when I was a fundamentalist Christian because you dared to go places I would not. And I thought you were, I don't know, I was in this bubble of a world where I just couldn't explore these ideas that you were, or books. You were going into treacherous territory that I just was saying, this is dangerous.
You know, many people have thought it was dangerous, Derek. I'm glad you brought that up. Because, I mean, I've heard that in some evangelical circles, they call me Elaine Pagan. But of course, I started out in an evangelical church as well. And that's what first showed me the passion and the power of these traditions about Jesus, right? I loved it. It was a Billy Graham rally when I was about 14. And, you know, he was great. You know, the call to the altar, I just loved it. I fell right in. And joined that church coming out of a secular background, Protestant but not religious. It was very powerful, and it was extraordinarily moving. It just sort of opened up the world in a way. But I had to get out of it too. So that's what took me into the questions that you're asking and that we're both asking, which is, what is this tradition about? What do we really know about Jesus? How did this movement start? What matters about it? What doesn't?
Wow. Yeah, and it's super powerful to explore those questions without the authoritarian requirement of you must not go in these areas, and you explore them. And that's what I really find fascinating. So the first question I have is Gnosticism versus Orthodox. Your book, The Gnostic Gospels, was a bombshell. It
was for me too.
What defines the true faith?
That is a very hard question to answer. I mean, when I went to graduate school, I was trying to find out, what do we know about Jesus? So I was thinking we'd start to read the New Testament Gospels, which we did. And we realized that they're really not written at the time of Jesus. You know, they're written 40, 50, 60 years later. But I was astonished to get to graduate school and find out that there were other Gospels we had never heard of. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Truth. What are these? Where did they come from? Well, they came from the beginning of the Christian movement. But they were completely suppressed, censored, burned, destroyed by bishops and leaders of the church in the 4th century. So all we heard was that there are good Gospels and there are bad ones. And those are the bad ones. They're called Gnostic because they claim to give you different elements of the teachings of Jesus. The Gospels in the New Testament, as you know, Jesus is teaching out in the fields, thousands of people listening, 4,000, 5,000, whatever. These Gospels claim to tell you what he told his disciples when they were alone together secretly. And Mark's Gospel in chapter 4 says, when Jesus was alone with his disciples, he said to them, I'm giving you the secret of the kingdom of God, or the word is the mystery of the kingdom of God. I mean, you say, what is the true faith? Well, you might get a different answer from a Roman Catholic, or a Catholic conservative, or a Catholic liberal, or a Baptist, a Presbyterian, a Methodist, Pentecostalist, a Christian Scientist, you know, Russian Orthodox. I mean, that's been a question that Christians disagree about. But these Gospels are meant for people who are at a different level of understanding. And so we were very curious about them as graduate students. Suddenly, there was a whole discovery made in Upper Egypt about the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1945. Suddenly, somebody found a huge library full of 51 secret texts from antiquity. Many of them are Christian. A lot of them are about Jesus and his disciples. And when I was in graduate school, this is like in 1970 and 80, they were finally available to look at. And we at graduate school, only at Harvard at that point and at Claremont, were allowed to look at them. They were sort of stamped top secret. And we began to read this stuff, and I assumed it was all my professor said, well, these Gospels are just weird. So I assumed that they were just weird. But actually I found that some of them have very powerful messages. So that's what got me fascinated. And say, today we have a much wider range of sources about Jesus than we used to have, say, 50 years ago.
So to say what is the true faith is actually, if you're limiting your scope of text, like I did before I met you, and before I actually tried to learn from you and want to know what you did and the path that you took and why, you're actually limiting your scope on what really might have been the true faith of Jesus. What this man, Jesus, may have actually taught people. You may limit what that is when you're only sticking to the Orthodox canon.
That's true. And you know that word Orthodox, it means straight thinking. And I always think of the term orthodontia, which means straight teeth. Straight thinking. This was because there were so many different perspectives about Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have 4 different perspectives. Now you've got a lot more. And then the question was that the leaders would say, well, okay, which ones are straight thinking? Which ones are right? And that's a tough question to answer. So they created the idea, well, we're going to take the ones in the New Testament, we're going to say, these are Orthodox. Now later, when we students were looking at this, I was as surprised as anybody to find that there were Gospels like that. And I kept trying to think, well, what's different about these? Because they're all different from each other. And realized that the Gospels in the New Testament all stress how unique Jesus is. And Jesus, no doubt, was an extraordinarily unique, charismatic person. No question about that. But what they all stress is that there's only one way to believe, and that's through what you see in the New Testament. And the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the ones that the church in the 4th century adopted to support its claim that there's one way to the truth, that's through Jesus. If you don't go that way, you go into eternal damnation. Anyone who's not a Christian, and preferably a Christian like us, whoever we are talking, then you're lost. And I think that, to me, that's a limiting point of view.
I think it's
I don't see that Jesus ever said that. Not in the New Testament either. Well, John's Gospel is different, because John's Gospel wants to stress that if you believe in Jesus, you're saved. If you don't believe in Jesus, you're damned. Whoever believes in him is already saved, and whoever doesn't is already condemned, because he hasn't believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. So John's Gospel is moving toward creating a sense, this is what you've got to believe. I don't see Jesus doing that in the early Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. When you start asking the question, who wrote these and how do we know? We find out there's a lot we don't know. Apparently, these texts were circulating without names. And the names, the Gospel according to Matthew, are given in the 2nd century by people who want to say, this is the right one. It's actually the way Matthew taught. Saying the Gospel according to Matthew doesn't necessarily mean that the disciple Matthew, the tax collector, wrote it. It could mean the Gospel the way our teacher Matthew taught it. The Gospel as Matthew taught it. Someone named Matthew. And those, as you say, have been misunderstood because we don't really know who wrote them. And when Matthew writes he takes Mark as his basic narrative. You know, Mark is shorter, 16 chapters. Matthew's twice as long, and he takes Mark's narrative and he sandwiches in other stories, other teachings. He changes the wording sometimes. He adds a birth story to say Jesus was conceived by a virgin. That's not in Mark either. And he adds many things that are quite different. So we have to ask, whose viewpoint is being expressed here? And what do we make of it when, as you say, when those Gospels themselves have different perspectives, as you'd expect, with different people writing them?